The storm came without warning across the lonely plains of the outpost world, a storm made not of rain but of fire and stone. For meteors streaked through the sky, and thunder rolled across the empty hills where no one had walked for years. In that remote place lived only one human, an old man who had long ago chosen silence and solitude instead of the crowded cities of the core worlds. His shelter was small and built of scavenged steel, weathered by wind and dust, yet still strong. Enough to hold against storms. He was used to being alone and had no expectation that his life would ever change again. But on that night, while the sky burned and the ground shook with falling rock, his world would change forever. He had gone outside to secure the panels of his generator, and as he moved through the whipping dust, he thought he heard something. At first it seemed like only the howl of the storm, yet beneath it was a sound too strange to ignore. It was a cry, high and trembling, carried through the chaos. He froze, listening, heart pounding, for no voice should have been there. Still, it came again, weak but desperate, like the cry of a creature on the edge of death. Without hesitation, he took a lantern and pushed into the storm. The cry drew him to a hollow where fragments of stone still burned with heat from their fall. There, half hidden beneath a broken wing of metal, lay a figure. She was small and thin, her skin a pale shade that shimmered faintly in the light, her hair long and tangled like strands of silver. Her body trembled as if from fever, and when she lifted her eyes toward him, he saw not human eyes but something deeper, dark orbs that seemed filled with both fear and exhaustion. She tried to rise, but collapsed again, and in that instant he felt the weight of her fragility. Without thinking, he bent and pulled the wreckage from her side, then lifted her into his arms. She was light, far lighter than he expected, and though her form looked almost human, her skin carried strange marks that shifted softly like living patterns. He carried her back through the storm, every step heavy, every breath strained, for he was not young anymore, and the storm battered him with dust and fire. Yet he refused to set her down, and at last the door of his shelter closed behind them. Inside, he laid her gently upon the old cot and covered her with a blanket. For a long time he simply looked at her, uncertain if she was real or if he had brought death into his home. Her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, and her hands twitched as if caught in some dream or battle within. He could have left her there and walked away, for she was not of his kind and he owed her nothing. But as he sat beside her, he remembered the silence of his days, the loss of those he had once loved, and how long it had been since anyone had looked at him with eyes that pleaded for life. He brought her water, lifting her head so she could drink, and though her lips trembled, she swallowed and let out a sigh that sounded like gratitude. She whispered words he did not understand, strange syllables broken by weakness, yet the tone was clear thankfulness, desperation, and trust. He answered softly, though he knew she could not understand, telling her she was safe here, telling her he would not let the storm take her away. Through the long night he tended her. At times her body shivered violently, as if seized by some inner fire, and he feared she might die before morning. Her skin grew hot to the touch, and her pulse beat like a drum beneath fragile veins. He wrapped her in cool cloths, whispered calm words, and sat awake while outside the storm tore across the land. In the dark, he wondered who she was, why she had fallen from the sky, and what danger might follow her. But the questions did not matter, not yet, for the only truth was that she was here, and she needed him. When dawn broke, the storm was gone, leaving the land scorched and silent. He opened the door and saw the wreckage of her craft lying broken across the hollow. There would be no way for her to leave soon, no chance of rescue unless others were already searching. He knew then that she would remain with him for at least a while, and though part of him feared what that might mean, another part felt something he had not known for years' purpose. When she woke at last, her eyes opened wide with fear, and she pulled back from him as if expecting harm. He raised his hand slowly, showing he meant no threat, and spoke in a calm voice. He told her again she was safe, and though she did not understand the words, something in his tone seemed to reach her. Her breathing steadied, and she lowered her gaze. She touched her chest lightly, whispered a sound, perhaps her name, though it slipped past his understanding. He nodded and repeated the sound as best he could, and a faint smile touched her lips. Fragile and fleeting but real, the old man felt something stir in his chest, a warmth he had thought long dead. He had once lived with family, once laughed and shared days filled with life, but those years were gone, taken by time and fate. Since then he had lived as a shadow, waiting only for the years to pass. Yet now, with this strange girl lying weak in his shelter, his heart beat with new strength. Still, there was unease. More than once he caught her trembling, as if in pain, her hands gripping the blanket with unnatural strength. Once, her eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, and her body shuddered with a force that frightened him. When he reached to steady her, she gasped and turned away, whispering something in a voice filled with warning. He did not understand, but her fear was clear, and it planted a seed of dread in his mind. Even so, he stayed close, offering water, offering warmth, offering the steady presence of someone who would not leave. She had no one else, and neither did he. The storm outside had passed, but within the walls of the shelter another storm had begun. One hidden in her blood and bones, one that even she could not control. The old human did not know this yet, but soon he would discover that the girl he had chosen to protect carried a secret as dangerous as the storm itself, a secret that would test his courage and his very humanity. The days after the storm were quiet, and for the old man it felt like the planet itself had paused. The sky was still, the wind soft, and the wreckage of the girl's broken craft lay across the valley like the bones of some fallen creature. In his small shelter, life began to shift in ways he had never expected. For so long he had lived with silence, the silence of empty rooms and unused words. But now there was movement and sound, the breathing of another life, the presence of someone who did not belong, yet somehow seemed to fill the air with a fragile light. The girl was weak at first, rising only to drink water or taste the simple food he prepared. She did not know the names for the things he gave her, but slowly she learned by watching his lips, repeating after him in a soft, uncertain voice. At times her words were broken, yet every attempt seemed to carry meaning far greater than the sound itself. He would say bread, and she would echo with a faint smile, bread. And though she struggled with the shape of the word, her eyes lit with pride as though each sound was a victory. He had not taught anyone for many years, but teaching her simple words awakened something deep in him, something close to joy. Yet even in these gentle moments, he felt the shadows of unease. At night when the stars shone cold above the shelter, he sometimes woke to the sound of her breathing, heavy and rough, as though she fought against her own body. He would find her curled tightly on the cot, her skin hot to the touch, her hands clutching at the blankets with unnatural strength. Once, when he tried to cool her with water, her eyes snapped open and glowed with a faint inner light, wild and untamed. She gasped a word he did not know, her voice sharp like a warning, before turning away with trembling shoulders. He did not press her then, but sat through the night watching, waiting, guarding. Even though fear stirred quietly in his chest, during the daylight hours she seemed calmer. She followed him outside sometimes, watching with curiosity as he worked on the foggy old machines that kept his home alive. She would kneel in the dust, running her hands across pieces of metal as though learning their weight and shape, her expression both innocent and serious. Once she lifted a heavy part that he himself struggled with, holding it easily as though it weighed nothing. He froze at the sight, the truth of her strength plain before him. Yet she quickly set it down again and looked away, ashamed, as if she wished to hide what she was. He said nothing, but the memory of that effortless power lingered in his thoughts. Despite his worries, he began to grow used to her presence. When she smiled faintly at him after repeating a new word, when she leaned against the wall listening to his stories, even though she could not yet understand most of them, when she followed him with soft steps as though afraid to be left alone, his heart softened. He knew she was not human, that her blood carried secrets, but he could not help but see her as someone who needed him, someone who had been thrown into his life like a gift he had never asked for but could not refuse. One evening, as the sun sank red across the sky, she sat near the door, staring out at the valley where her broken craft lay. The light painted her face with fire, and her eyes seemed far away, filled with sadness. She raised her hand as if to touch the horizon and whispered, in her own language, a sound filled with longing. He came beside her, not knowing what she said, but hearing the ache in her tone. Slowly he placed a hand over his heart and then pointed to her, then to himself, then to the sky, hoping to tell her that though her home was far, she was not alone here. For a moment she looked at him in silence, then nodded, tears shining in her strange eyes. That night he dreamed of storms again, but this time it was not fire from the sky, but a storm within her, a storm he could not see yet felt pressing closer each day. He woke to find her standing near the window, her shoulders shaking, her breath fast, her hands gripping the frame so tightly that the metal bent beneath her touch. She turned quickly when she saw him, her face pale, her lips parted as though she wanted to speak but could not find the words. Then she whispered something he barely caught, a sound heavy with warning. He stepped closer, asking softly if she was in pain, but she shook her head violently and pressed her hands against her chest. If I lose control, she said in broken human words, you must run. The words cut through him like a blade. He stood frozen, staring at her trembling form, the glow in her eyes brighter now, the veins on her arms pulsing faintly with a strange rhythm. She was frightened, not of him but of herself, and the truth of her struggle became clearer. He wanted to press her for answers, to demand what she meant, but the fear in her voice held him silent. Instead he shook his head slowly, refusing her command. He could not run. He had already chosen to protect her, whatever the cost. From that moment on, a tension hung in the air between them. She still learned words, still followed him into the daylight, still smiled in fleeting moments, but beneath all of it was the weight of that warning. He began to notice small changes, her heartbeat echoing like a drum when she was near, her skin warmer each day, her eyes flickering with light when she thought he was not looking. It was as though something inside her was waking, something she could no longer keep hidden. The old man felt torn. Part of him wanted to believe she was simply healing, that her body was strange but not dangerous. Yet the memory of her words haunted him. If I lose control, you must run. What kind of force lived inside her that even she feared it? What storm was waiting to break free? As he lay awake at night, listening to the soft sound of her breathing from across the room, he knew one thing with certainty. He could not abandon her. He had lost too much already, too many faces, too many voices that time had taken. To leave her now would be to betray the only bond he had left. No matter what. Secret burned in her blood, he would stay. He would protect her, even if it meant standing against something he did not yet understand. And as the days moved on and the glow in her eyes grew stronger, he began to realize that the storm she carried was not far away. It was coming. It was inevitable. And when it arrived, the lonely shelter in the hills would no longer be the quiet, safe place it had once been. The days that followed were unlike anything the old man had known before. He had thought at first that the girl's weakness would pass, that she would heal in time and become steady like any other living being. But instead of fading, her strange changes only grew stronger, and with each sunrise he felt the weight of something dangerous drawing closer. He had never feared storms or the emptiness of his lonely world, but the thought of what might live inside her filled him with both dread and sorrow, for he cared for her already, and he could not stop himself from hoping she would survive whatever battle her body was fighting. It began with her eyes. At first, they were only bright when she was in pain, a glow that seemed to rise from deep inside her. But soon the light came more often, flashing in the dark like a signal she could not hide. Her pupils shifted, widening unnaturally, and when she looked at him, he sometimes felt a weight, as if her gaze pressed into his chest with a force more than human. She tried to hide it by turning away, but he saw, and the fear in her expression told him that she knew he had noticed. Her heartbeat too was changing. When she stood near him he could hear it, a sound that should have been quiet yet seemed loud, pounding like a drum. At night when silence filled the shelter, the rhythm carried across the room until he could not sleep, his thoughts racing with questions. Was it sickness? Was it hunger? Or was it something else entirely? Something beyond the grasp of human knowledge. One evening, when the sky outside burned red with the last light of day, he found her kneeling on the floor, clutching her arms and shaking. Her breathing was rough, her body trembling as though fire consumed her veins. He rushed to her side, reaching to steady her, but she raised her head with eyes shining so brightly that for a moment he thought he was staring into the core of a star. "No," she gasped, voice strained and broken. "Stay back." Her hands shook with tension, her nails digging into the skin of her arms, yet she did not attack. Instead, she forced herself against the wall, her whole body fighting an unseen storm. He wanted to hold her, to help, but the fear in her words froze him. Later, when the storm inside her eased, she collapsed, exhausted, whispering something he could not understand. He wrapped her in a blanket, carried her back to the cot, and sat beside her through the night. As he watched her sleep, his heart ached with helplessness. He had no medicine for this, no knowledge that could heal her. All he had was his presence, his choice to remain by her side. Though she had warned him again and again to run, the next morning she was quieter than usual, her face pale, her eyes heavy with shame. She avoided his gaze, moving slowly around the shelter, repeating words in a soft voice, as though trying to distract herself. But when he came near, she flinched, not from fear of him, but from fear of herself. He saw it in her trembling hands, in the way she pressed her palms together, as though trying to keep them still. He wanted to tell her she was safe, that nothing she did could drive him away, but he also knew the truth, that something inside her was changing, and it might one day burst free in a way neither of them could stop. That evening, she finally spoke more than broken words. She had been learning his language with effort, and now she strung together a sentence that struck him with both clarity and sorrow. "Inside me is danger," she said slowly, her voice trembling. "Season comes. Blood burns. I cannot stop." The words chilled him. He did not understand fully, but he grasped enough. She was not sick. She was not dying. She was entering some kind of natural cycle, one her kind could not control. It was not illness but instinct, not weakness but power. And if she was warning him, it meant that what lay ahead was far worse than what he had seen already. He asked her what would happen, but she only shook her head, eyes wet with fear. "If I lose control, you must run," she repeated once more. The plea in her voice was heavy, but he answered with silence, for he could not promise her that. He had lived too long with the weight of loss, too long in shadows of memory, and now that she was here, he could not abandon her, no matter the cost. Still, he was human, and he was afraid. That night he dreamed again, but it was no simple dream. In it, her eyes burned like suns, her voice cried out in pain and hunger, and the shelter shook as if the walls could not contain the storm she became. He woke sweating, his heart pounding. And when he turned his head, he saw her lying on the cot, her chest rising with shallow breaths, her skin glowing faintly in the dim light. She looked peaceful in sleep, almost fragile, yet he knew it was only the calm before the storm. The following days passed in tension. She tried to live as before, learning new words, watching him work, even laughing once when he dropped a tool, and cursed under his breath. But always there was the edge of something greater pressing close. Her body grew warmer each day, her eyes brighter, her strength less hidden. Once, when she touched his arm by accident, he felt a heat so sharp it left his skin tingling for hours. She pulled away instantly, horrified, but he caught her hand gently and shook his head, refusing to let her drown in shame. Still, the fear in her expression did not fade. The old man began preparing without telling her. He checked his tools, reinforced the walls, and studied the land around the shelter for places where he might set traps or barriers if danger came from outside. Part of him wondered if others of her kind might come searching for her, drawn by whatever change was happening inside her. Another part of him feared that the real danger was not out there, but here, within his own walls. Yet through all of this, he could not walk away. Each time she spoke a new word in his language, each time she looked at him with eyes full of trust despite her fear, he felt bound to her more deeply. He had lived so long without purpose, and now he had one again to protect her, even if she believed she was beyond saving. But as the third week approached, the signs grew undeniable. Her glow no longer faded, her voice carried a strange echo, and her body trembled with restless energy as though her very blood was on fire. The storm inside her was close to breaking, and the old man knew that when it did, the life they had built together in quiet moments would shatter. He stood one night watching her sleep, his hands trembling not from age but from the weight of choice. She had told him to run. He had told himself to stay. And soon, very soon, he would learn whether his choice was one of courage or one of madness. The change came with the heat. The old man felt it before. He saw it, the air inside the shelter growing heavy, warm like the breath of fire. At first he thought the generator was failing, but then he saw her standing in the middle of the room, her body trembling as if the heat came from within her. Her eyes glowed brighter than he had ever seen, her skin shimmering with faint moving patterns, her breath rough and fast. She clutched at her chest and sank to her knees, whispering words in her own tongue, words that carried the sound of both pleading and warning. He rushed to her side, calling her name as best he could, but when he reached for her, she pulled back with a violent jerk, her hands striking the floor with such force that cracks spread through the metal plate beneath her. "Stay away," she gasped, the words broken, but clear enough. "I cannot hold it, I cannot stop." The old man froze, his heart pounding. He had seen storms, wars, and machines break apart under pressure, but nothing frightened him like the sight of her, fighting her own body. Her muscles tightened, her veins glowed faintly, and her heartbeat echoed so loudly that it filled the air like a drum. She pressed her fists against her temples, her voice rising in a cry of pain, and for a moment the old man thought she would tear herself apart. He wanted to hold her, to steady her, to remind her she was not alone. But he remembered her warning: if she lost control, he must run. Still he could not move. His feet were rooted to the floor, not from fear, but from something stronger, a refusal to abandon her even now. She had come into his life by chance, and she had filled his empty days with purpose again. He could not leave her to face this storm by herself. Then it happened. She rose suddenly to her feet, her body shaking, her eyes burning with unnatural light. Her voice was no longer weak but loud and sharp, filled with power. She turned toward him, her breathing like the panting of a beast, and for an instant he thought she would strike. Her hands lifted, trembling, claws beginning to form at her fingertips, but then she froze, her eyes locking on his face. Tears streamed down her glowing cheeks, and she screamed in frustration, turning away and slamming her fists against the wall instead. The metal dented under the impact, the whole shelter shaking. She was fighting herself, fighting the instinct that pushed her toward violence, but the struggle left her weaker each moment. The old man stepped forward despite the danger. He spoke softly, repeating the words he had told her from the beginning. "Safe, you are safe. I am here." She sobbed, falling to her knees again, her hands pressed against the floor, her body shaking so violently that dust fell from the ceiling. It was then the old man heard another sound outside the shelter. At first he thought it was the wind, but then he knew better. Heavy steps, more than one, moving with purpose. He rushed to the window and looked out into the night. In the distance, glowing shapes moved across the valley, figures tall and broad, their armor shining faintly in the starlight. His heart sank. They were hunters. They had followed her scent, her energy, or perhaps the signal of her broken craft. Whatever the reason, they were here, and they were coming for her. He turned back to her. She was still on the floor, her body burning with heat, her instincts raging, her eyes pleading with him to leave. But he could not. Now he understood. Her cycle, her deadly mating season, made her vulnerable not only to herself, but also to others of her kind, or those who hunted her. They would come to claim her, to control her, and she had fled to escape them. The old man's hands trembled as he gathered his tools. Not weapons in the true sense, but all he had: a welding torch, a hammer, a few charges meant for breaking stone. He checked the doors and reinforced them with heavy bars. His body was tired and weak with age, but his spirit was firm. He had once been a soldier long ago, before he had chosen this lonely life. The years had taken his strength, but not his. As the hunters drew closer, their voices echoed through the valley, strange guttural calls that carried both command and hunger. The girl lifted her head, her glowing eyes filled with terror. "They come," she whispered. "They will take me. You must run." The old man shook his head. "No," he said simply. "I will not leave." His voice was steady, and though she wept, she knew he meant it. The first strike came against the door, a heavy crash that shook the frame. The old man steadied himself, his tools ready, his heart calm in its storm. The girl rose behind him, her body trembling with instinct, her eyes wild, her strength building with every breath. She was afraid of herself, afraid of what she might do, but she was also afraid of them, the hunters who would drag her away and use her for what she was. Another strike came, then another, until the door bent under the force. The old man set his charges at the entrance, a trap that would slow them down. He turned to the girl one last time. "Listen to me," he said softly. "You are not alone. You do not belong to them. You are more than this season, more than this storm. I will fight with you." Her lips parted, her voice shaking. "I will hurt you." "You will not," he said firmly, stepping closer to place his hand against her burning arm. "Because you are stronger than this. And I am with you." For a moment she stared at him, the glow in her eyes flickering with something other than rage. Then the door burst inward with a crash of sparks and fire. The hunters entered, tall and terrible, their weapons raised. The girl screamed, not in pain but in fury, and the shelter filled with light as her instincts broke free. The old man raised his torch, his heart steady. He would not run. Together they would face what came, human and alien, fragile and powerful, bound by something deeper than fear. And so the storm truly began. The door burst open in a storm of sparks, metal bending under the force of the hunters. The old man stood firm, his torch blazing in his hand, his back straight despite the years that weighed on him. The alien girl stood beside him, her body trembling, her glow spreading like fire through the dim shelter. The air was hot, alive, with the sound of her heartbeat, but her eyes were wide with fear. She was torn between two storms, the hunger of her instincts and the terror of the hunters, who had come to claim her. The first hunter stepped through the wrecked doorway, towering and armored, his weapon raised. The old man pressed the charge he had set at the entrance, and the trap exploded in a blast of light and fire. The hunter was thrown back, crashing into the figures behind him. Dust filled the room, sparks dancing in the air, and for a heartbeat, there was silence. Then came the roar of fury as the hunter surged forward again. The girl cried out, her voice wild, her body shaking as the storm of her season tried to take her. She fell to her knees, her claws forming, her breath heavy like a beast. The old man knelt in front of her, his hand gripping her arm even as her heat burned his skin. "Look at me," he said firmly, his voice louder than the chaos outside. "You are not theirs. You are not only this season. You are more." Her eyes locked on him, glowing and wet with tears, and for a moment she stilled. The hunters crashed through the remains of the door again, weapons raised, their guttural voices echoing with hunger. The old man rose to his feet, his heart steady, and faced them with nothing but his tools and his unshakable will. The battle was chaos. The old man used every scrap of knowledge from his years, striking with traps he had built into the shelter, swinging his hammer with desperate strength, using the welding torch as a weapon of fire. He moved not like a soldier, but like a survivor, clever and relentless, each step chosen with care. The hunters were stronger, faster, but they had not expected an old human to resist. His defiance slowed them, confused them, bought precious moments. And in those moments the girl's storm turned. Her body glowed brighter, her strength surged, and with a scream she launched herself at the hunters. She was fury and fire, her instincts bursting free, her claws tearing into armor, her voice shaking the walls. Yet even as she fought, she remembered his words. She did not turn on him. She struck only at the ones who came for her. The hunters roared in rage as one fell, then another. Their weapons cut through the air, but she was faster, her body burning with the power of her cycle. The old man fought at her side, his breath ragged, his arms shaking with effort, but his spirit unbroken. He had thought himself useless in the world of the young, but here in this moment he found himself alive again, every heartbeat sharp with purpose. Still, the fight was not easy. More hunters forced their way inside, their strength pressing harder. The girl staggered, her glow flickering as though she would collapse. The old man saw it and stepped forward, placing himself between her and the next blow. The weapon struck his side, and he cried out in pain, falling to one knee. Her scream shook the shelter. She surged forward with strength beyond anything she had shown before, her fury blazing brighter than fire. She struck down the hunter that had hurt him, tearing his weapon aside, breaking his armor with her bare hands. She fought like a storm unleashed, but this time it was not only instinct, it was choice. She chose to protect him, to fight for him, to stand with him. The battle raged until the last hunter fell, their bodies broken across the floor, their voices silenced. Smoke filled the air, dust settling, the shelter scarred but still standing. The girl collapsed beside the old man, her body shaking, her glow fading slowly. She reached for him, her hands trembling. "I hurt you," she whispered in broken words. He shook his head, gripping her hand with strength that belied his pain. "No," he said softly. "You saved me. You saved us both." His eyes were steady, filled with the warmth she had seen in him from the first day. "You are not only what your blood says you are more." She wept then, the storm inside her easing, her instincts quieting as the season passed. For the first time in days her eyes lost their unnatural glow, leaving only the fragile sadness of someone who had feared herself but now had hope. She pressed her forehead against his chest, her tears soaking into his worn shirt, and he held her, ignoring the pain in his ribs, ignoring the wounds on his skin. When morning came, the valley was silent again. The hunters were gone, defeated, their shadows no longer threatening. The girl sat outside the shelter with the old man, watching the sun rise over the hills. Her body was weak, still trembling from the storm, but her eyes were calm now, filled with something new: gratitude, trust, hope. She spoke slowly, carefully, each word shaped with effort. "You did not run, you stayed." He nodded, his voice steady. "I told you, you are not alone." For a long time they sat in silence, the light warming their faces, the future uncertain but open. The old man knew his days were fewer now, his body frail, his wounds aching. But he also knew he had found a purpose again. He would teach her, guide her, help her learn control, help her see that she was more than instinct. And in return, she gave him what he had thought long lost: companionship, meaning, and a reason to rise each day. The shelter was no longer silent. The storm had passed, but its mark remained, not as ruin, but as bond. The old man and the alien girl had faced death together and survived. Their story was not one of power or conquest, but of humanity's greatest strength: the courage to stand when others would run, and the compassion to see more than fear in the face of another. And so their lives began anew, not as a man and a stranger, not as captor and captive, but as two souls bound by survival, trust, and a promise stronger than blood. The old man had sheltered her without knowing what storm she carried. He had faced her deadly season, her hunters, and even her own fear. And in the end, he had shown her what it meant to be human: not power, not strength of body, but the unshakable will to protect, to endure, and to love even when the world burned around them. The end.